Welcome back. Thanks very much for staying on with us here on WION World is One. The UN General Assembly is currently holding a meeting on Ukraine. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations is currently speaking. Let's take a listen in.
Russia's actions are an unprovoked violation of international law, of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and a direct contradiction of the Minsk agreements. Russia's aggression not only threatens all of Ukraine, but every member state and the UN itself. Colleagues, President Putin gave us the clearest indication of his intentions on Monday when he asked the world to travel back in time by more than 100 years before the United Nations even existed to an age of empires. He asserted that Russia can recolonize its neighbors and that he will use force to make a farce of the United Nations. The United States rejects that firmly. This is 2022. We're not going back to an era of empires and colonies or to the USSR or the Soviet Union. We have moved forward. And we must ensure, as the permanent representative from Kenya said in the Security Council on Monday night, that the embers of dead empires do not ignite new forms of oppression and violence. Unfortunately, the fake reality Russia wants to create is already having real consequences for the people of Ukraine and for the world. To date, Russia's war in eastern Ukraine has already killed more than 14,000 people, nearly 3 million Ukrainians, half of whom are elderly people and children, need food, shelter, and other life-saving assistance. And of course, ordinary Russians should be asking how many Russian lives Putin is willing to sacrifice to feed his ambitions. If Russia continues down this path, it could, according to our estimates, create a new refugee crisis, one of the largest facing the world today, with as many as 5 million more people displaced by Russia's war of choice and putting pressure on Ukraine's neighbors. And because Ukraine is one of the world's largest wheat suppliers, especially for the developing world, Russia's actions could cause a spike in food prices and lead to even more desperate hunger in places like Libya, Yemen, and Lebanon. The tidal wave of suffering this war will cause are unthinkable. And then there's the broader threat that Russia's actions upend our international system, make a mockery of the UN Charter, and call into question our most fundamental principles of sovereignty, diplomacy, and territorial integrity. Unfortunately, despite these terrible, world-altering outcomes, Russia appears determined to proceed. Together with our partners and allies, President Biden has taken decisive action to make the cost of Russia's actions crystal clear. But as much as we all want Russia to de-escalate and choose the path of peace, that is not our choice to make. This is President Putin's war of choice. If he chooses to escalate further, Russia and Russia alone will bear full responsibility for what is to come. What we can do together today is make clear that Russia will pay an even steeper price if it continues this aggression, that responsible countries do not bully their neighbors into submission, that former empires cannot lay claim to sovereign and independent nations. The very first line of the UN Charter states, "We are uniting together," quote, "determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war." This, right here, right now, is a moment. It is a moment when we can save this generation and the next from that terrible fate. Colleagues, now is not the time to sit on the sidelines. Now is the time to get off of the sidelines. Let us together show Russia that it is isolated and alone in its aggressive actions. Let us stand fully behind the principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity for Ukraine and for all member states. Let us show Russia that every other UN member state believes it is time to de-escalate, to come back to the negotiating table, and to work toward peace so that Ukrainians can live in security and the tenets of the UN Charter can be upheld for future generations to come. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Georgia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, my delegation aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union and in my national...
We were listening in to the address delivered by the United States representative to the United Nations as the UNGA holds a meeting on the Ukraine crisis. The U.S. representative saying that now is not the time to sit on the sidelines. It is the time for the international community to show Russia that it is isolated and alone in its aggressive action. And it's time to work towards peace and uphold the United Nations Charter, and that former empires cannot lay claim to sovereign countries. Let's get in further details and perspectives now from my colleague Susan Teherani, who is at the UN General Assembly. We have seen a reiteration of the stance that was already made clear by the American president, Susan, but the criticism that is coming in from the United States is that the measures announced so far are not enough and do not match the promises that Joe Biden had made earlier on.
Absolutely, and that is, the concern that has been really echoing even from Joe Biden's ardent supporters. I can give you an example, Chris Coons, who holds his seat in Delaware right now, one that he had for years in the Senate before becoming president. And, many wanted to see a more aggressive stance on the part of Joe Biden, not just because they wanted to see these sanctions against Russia, but also because they wanted to see a policy from the Biden administration that moved away from what Obama did in its foreign policy, and that was setting red lines and not adhering to it. And Joe Biden explicitly said for months and weeks that should a single Russian troop go into Ukraine, Russia would see never before unprecedented sanctions. We saw that language change, kind of scramble, first of all calling what Russia did an invasion or not on the eve that Russia did in fact go into Ukraine, and then the next day trying to push that back and saying, quote, it's a start of an invasion, hence this is start of sanctions. Now, what this means right now for the Ukrainians, and we did hear the Ukrainian foreign minister speak here at the United Nations General Assembly earlier. He was grateful for the steps that the United States is taking, but he also mentioned in not so many words that ultimately when you say that we will see what Russia does and then take additional measures, what good would those sanctions do after Russia has already occupied a big chunk of Ukraine or already has moved into Kiev? The discussion before was what will happen if the United States imposes sanctions and Russia moves anyway. Now the fear is that the United States and its allies aren't moving fast enough, especially now that we know that nuclear option, which was throwing Russia out of the SWIFT banking system, is off the table. We know that because countries like Austria, even France, and the Netherlands have lines of credit open with Russia that they can't jeopardize right now. They would be affected as well if that nuclear option gets pulled against Russia. So that's off the table. Russia's oil and gas sector being sanctioned is off the table. One, not because the United States is scared of Russia, because it would jack up prices for the American public here in the United States. So it's left with, limited options. The limited options that it has, it's starting to implement. It depends on who you ask. Biden supporters say that he's taking a step-by-step measures. Others are saying it might be too little too late. So, it is what it is, and we'll have to see. Unfortunately, the situation right now is it seems the Biden administration is just waiting to see what steps Putin takes and then take countermeasures. And I think that's where the criticism is coming from. Why isn't this administration ahead of Putin?
Indeed, and question marks also over whether or not the West will be able to put up a more united front when it comes to dealing with the Russian aggression. We're leaving it there for the moment. Susan, thanks very much for those inputs and perspectives. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.